January 4th, 1935. Kansas City, Missouri. The nude body of a young man named Roland T. Owen is discovered inside room 1046 of the Hotel President. He has been tied up, beaten, and stabbed, and dies after being taken to the hospital. It turns out that Roland T. Owen is not the victim's real name, and after a mysterious anonymous benefactor sends money for his funeral, he is buried without anyone uncovering his true identity or the story behind his murder. Nearly 2 years later, a woman in Alabama recognizes the victim as her missing son, Artemus Ogletree, but it turns out she was receiving letters from him months after he was murdered. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and today I will be presenting our final Halloween-themed episode for the month of October. As you probably know, I've spent the entire month covering cases which I've featured in the Halloween-themed articles I've written for Crack.com during the past few years. The first part of a mammoth Halloween-themed two-part article I co-wrote titled The 11 Creepiest Unsolved Crimes No One Can Explain just went up on Cracked the day before this episode was released, and it features today's case. So if you've just read that article and are anxious to learn more about the case, today's your lucky day. I decided to leave the best Halloween-themed story for last because, let me tell you, this case is a real doozy. I only found out about it a few months ago on the website for the Kansas City Public Library, of all places, and it totally blew my mind. I haven't seen too many murder cases with the bizarre twists and turns that this one has. If there weren't original newspaper articles about this case available online, I'd almost think this story was a work of fiction. We're going all the way back to the 1930s for this one, but even though this case is nearly 82 years old and will probably never be solved, I could not resist the urge to cover it. I'm wagering that the vast majority of you folks never heard of this case, but that is pretty much the MO of The Trail Went Cold, to familiarize you with lesser-known mysteries which ordinarily don't get a lot of exposure. So I really hope you enjoy this one. But before we get started, let's take a brief moment to get some business out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is now a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and 15 to 20-minute mini-sodes about smaller-scale cold cases which don't have as much material. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new mini-sode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we will happily give any of our wonderful donors a shout-out on a future episode. We've actually received quite a few donations this past week, and I'd like to thank every one of these wonderful donors, whose names are Kelly, Jessica, Dawn, and Casey. And I should also mention that Dawn and Casey have both signed up for regular monthly donations, which is an option we have that any of our listeners can do if they wish. So a big thanks to all of you for your generosity. So with all that out of the way, it is now time for me to share with you the mystery of Room 1046. Our story begins in Kansas City, Missouri in 1935. Our central figure is a young man who checks into the Hotel President on the afternoon of January 2nd and registers under the name Roland T. Owen. He lists his hometown as Los Angeles, asks for a room which is several floors up, and he is given room 1046. The man carried no luggage, and the only items he seemed to have on him were a comb, hairbrush, and toothpaste. The most distinguishing characteristic about him was a large scar on the side of his scalp, located above his cauliflower left ear. Anyway, over the course of the next 2 days, a strange series of events would surround Roland's stay at the hotel. For starters, he would have a few odd encounters with one of the maids. Shortly after Roland checked in, this maid showed up at room 1046 to clean it while he was getting ready to leave, and she noticed that he seemed nervous. When she entered the room, it was dark and the shades were drawn. In fact, every hotel staff member who entered room 1046 during Roland's stay there would describe the room as being dark with the shades drawn. Before Roland left, he told the maid he was expecting a friend, and asked her to leave the door unlocked when she was done. Later that day, the maid returned with fresh towels and saw that Roland was lying on the bed. She also noticed a note on the desk which read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The following morning, the maid returned to the room, and this time Roland was sitting in the dark, staring blankly. While the maid was there, the phone rang, and Roland answered it. She heard him saying, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast." The maid returned again that afternoon with a fresh set of towels, but this time she heard two men speaking behind the closed door. When she knocked and said she had clean towels, a man who did not sound like Roland responded that they did not need any, so the maid left without opening the door. The following morning, the telephone operator at the hotel noticed that the phone in room 1046 had been off the hook for an abnormally long amount of time without anyone using it, so she asked a bellboy to go up there to ask the guest to hang up the phone. The bellboy went there and discovered that the door was locked with a do not disturb sign, but he knocked anyway. She then heard a voice from inside say, "Come in," but the bellboy couldn't go in because no one would unlock the door. The bellboy kept knocking, and all he heard was someone in the room telling him to turn on the light. Assuming the guest was drunk or something, the bellboy yelled at him to hang up the phone and left. Well, an hour and a half passed, and the operator noticed that the phone was still off the hook, so she sent another bellboy to room 1046 with a passkey. The bellboy unlocked the door and went inside, and of course, the room was completely dark with the shades drawn. He noticed that the guest was lying naked on the bed, face down. Once again, this bellboy just assumed the guest must be drunk or sleeping, so he walked over to the phone, which was on the floor, put the receiver back on the hook, and left without saying anything. Well, guess what? A few hours later, another operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook again, so the first bellboy was sent back up there. After receiving no answer to repeated knocks, the bellboy used his passkey to go inside, and this time, he finally lifted the shades and turned the lights on. Well, he would soon be treated to a shocking sight, as he realized there was blood everywhere. The walls, the bed, the bathroom, even the ceiling. He then noticed Roland T. Owen's nude, barely conscious body was sprawled on the floor, and that he was holding his head in his hands. Roland had been restrained with some cord, which was tied around his neck, wrist, and ankles. It was apparent that the guy had been tortured, as he was beaten across the right side of his head so severely that his skull was fractured. Roland had also been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, puncturing his lung, and bruises on his neck suggested he had also been strangled. In spite of this, Roland was still conscious. When a doctor and the police were summoned, they asked Roland who had done this to him. He muttered, "Nobody. I fell against the bathtub," before losing consciousness. While being transported to the hospital, Roland slipped into a coma and died sometime after midnight. And thus the mystery of room 1046 was born. Right from the outset, it was obvious this was going to be one of the most bizarre murder cases ever. For starters, the entire hotel room was almost completely devoid of items. Even though Roland had been found naked, all of his clothing was missing, along with the hairbrush, toothpaste, and comb he had with him when he checked in. Not only that, but even items belonging to the hotel were missing, such as the soap, shampoo, and towels. Roland's room key was never found either. The only items left behind in the room were an unsmoked cigarette, a label from a necktie, a safety pin, a hairpin, and a small bottle of dilute sulfuric acid. And there was no sign of any murder weapons. There were 2 water glasses remaining in the bathroom, but one of them was missing a jagged piece. There were also 4 smudged bloody fingerprints on the telephone stand which appeared to be female, but they could not be matched to anyone. Since most of the blood in the room was already dry, that seemed to indicate that Roland had been tortured around 6 or 7 hours before he was found. It wasn't long before investigators learned of several suspicious events which occurred the night before. That evening, a female guest checked into room 1048, and ironically enough, her name was Jean Owen, even though she had no connection to Roland. Throughout the night, Jean claimed to hear both male and female voices arguing inside room 1046, and thought it sounded like 2 separate couples were in there. At one point, she believed she heard a scuffle, and what she described as a gasping sound. She thought about complaining to the desk clerk, but decided not to. An elevator operator also reported taking a woman to the 10th floor that night, and she told him she was planning to visit room 1026. He actually had seen this woman around the hotel on previous occasions in the company of different men, so it's possible she was a prostitute. The elevator operator dropped her off on the 10th floor, but was summoned back there a few minutes later by the same woman, who claimed that the man she was supposed to meet wasn't in his room. The woman soon left the hotel, but actually returned there 1 hour later with an unidentified man, and this time they were both taken to the 9th floor. The operator claimed that the woman left the hotel for good at 4:15 a.m. and that her male companion left separately about 15 minutes later. If you follow the timeline, this would have been around the same time period it's believed Roland was beaten and tortured. If that wasn't enough, at around 11 p.m. that same night, a motorist named Robert Lane was driving a few blocks away from the hotel when he noticed a young man walking down the street dressed only in an undershirt, which was very unusual since this was a cold winter night. The young man mistakenly thought Lane was a taxi driver and flagged him down for a ride, but Lane still drove him to a location where he could find a cab. Lane noticed that his passenger appeared to have a scratch on his left arm, and before he was dropped off, the man muttered that he was going to kill someone tomorrow. And the plot continued to thicken once they attempted to do a background check on the late Roland T. Owen, and couldn't find any record of him anywhere, so it was apparent that he had checked into the hotel under an alias. In an attempt to get him identified, Roland's body was actually put on public display at a funeral home, and the police asked people to drop by and see if they recognized him. Well, one person who did this was Robert Lane, and he identified Roland as the man he gave a ride to that night. He noticed a deep scratch on Roland's left arm, which seemed to match the scratch his passenger had. Some witnesses also recalled seeing Roland at some liquor joints in the company of 2 women. And believe it or not, a wrestling promoter from Little Rock, Arkansas also recognized Roland, claiming that the young man had once attempted to sign up for some wrestling matches and gave his name as Cecil Werner, which turned out to be an alias as well. Since Roland had a cauliflower ear, it's not implausible that he could have been involved in wrestling. It also turned out that the night before Roland checked into the President Hotel, he stayed at the Muhlebach Hotel under the name Eugene K. Scott, and once again gave Los Angeles as his hometown. When he checked into the President Hotel, Roland told the bellboy he had stayed at the Muehlebach the night before, so it seemed likely that Eugene K. Scott was the same man. But guess what? That name didn't check out either. In spite of the fact that numerous people seemed to recognize the man known as Roland T. Owen, none of them actually knew what his real identity was. After 2 months, the police had no luck identifying him, so arrangements were made to finally bury him in an unmarked grave at the local Potter's Field. And this is when the case started taking a turn towards the surreal. On March 3rd, an article about Roland T. Owen was published in the Kansas City Journal-Post, which reported that he was going to be buried in the Potter's Field. The paper soon received a phone call from an anonymous woman who assured them that arrangements would be made for a proper funeral. When asked about what happened to Roland, the woman simply replied he got into a jam before hanging up. And incredibly, her prophecy came true. At around the same time, the funeral home handling Roland's body received a call from an anonymous male who said, "I want you to bury him in Memorial Park Cemetery. Then he will be near my sister. I'll send some funds to cover the expense." You might assume this was some anonymous benefactor who felt pity for the young man, but things got a bit dark when the caller claimed that Roland had jilted a girl he planned to marry and that the three of them met up at the President Hotel. He then said, "Cheaters usually get what's coming to them," before hanging up. The funeral director probably felt a bit skeptical about this, but amazingly, an anonymous delivery of $25 did arrive at the funeral home to pay for Roland's burial. But that's not all. Around the same time, a local florist received an order for 13 roses to be sent to Roland's funeral, and once again, an anonymous male caller placed the order and claimed he was doing it for his sister. Shortly thereafter, $5 was mailed to the florist, along with a card to accompany the roses which read, "Love forever, Louise." So yeah, there is the distinct possibility that Roland T. Owen's murderer picked up the tab for his funeral, which is so messed up. Anyway, the only people who actually attended Roland's funeral were the detectives working the case, who served as pallbearers. After he was buried, the detectives disguised themselves as gravediggers to stake out Roland's grave in case any strangers showed up. But no one ever did. It would be nearly 2 years before Roland T. Owen's true identity was finally uncovered, but it only opened up a lot more baffling questions. In November of 1936, a Birmingham, Alabama woman named Ruby Ogletree received a magazine featuring an article about the mystery of room 1046. She saw a photo of the mysterious Roland T. Owen and thought he looked an awful lot like her missing son, Artemus Ogletree. Ruby had not seen Artemis since he hitchhiked out of their hometown to travel to California in April of 1934, so she got in touch with the authorities in Kansas City. Ruby, her husband, and her daughter all looked at photos of Roland and conclusively identified the victim as Artemus Ogletree, who was only 17 years old at the time he was murdered. The most definitive proof was the scar on Roland's scalp, as the Ogletree family claimed that Artemis got that scar in a childhood accident when he was burned with hot grease. But even though the mystery was now partially solved, this revelation only made the story even stranger, because it turns out the Ogletree family had been receiving letters from Artemis after he was murdered. Starting in the spring of 1935, the Ogletrees received a pair of typewritten letters from Artemis in which he claimed he'd been traveling and was currently sailing for Europe. These letters were postmarked from Chicago and New York. The Ogletrees found these letters to be very suspicious, since Artemis apparently couldn't type. But then Ruby Ogletree received a strange phone call in August of 1935 from a man calling himself Jordan, who said he was phoning from Memphis. Jordan claimed that he and Artemis were friends, and that Artemis had saved his life during a barroom brawl in Egypt. However, Artemis wound up losing his thumb in the incident, which is why he can no longer write letters to his family. Jordan assured Mrs. Ogletree that Artemis had recently gotten married to a wealthy woman in Cairo. After this phone call, the Ogletrees never heard from Artemis or Jordan again. So yeah, even though Roland T. Owen had officially been identified as Artemus Ogletree, this still didn't shed any light on the bizarre circumstances of his death, so the case went cold again. But astonishingly, there was one last development which occurred nearly 70 years later. Dr. John Horner, a writer-researcher at the Kansas City Public Library, took an out-of-state phone call from someone inquiring about the case. They claimed they were going through the belongings of someone who had recently died and found a box containing old newspaper clippings about the mystery of room 1046. The caller then said they also found something in the box which had been mentioned in the articles, but they never actually said what this something was. So, I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, after all that, what else can I really say except, this case is batshit insane. Nothing about this crime makes any sense at all. What really sticks out for me are the bizarre contradictions in this story. For example, whoever victimized Artemis seemed to go to a lot of trouble with covering their tracks, as they removed nearly every single item from the hotel room, including Artemis's clothing. Yet they seemed to overlook the most important step, making sure Artemis was dead. They attacked him pretty severely, yet he was still alive when they left the room, and he held on for several more hours. Did they only intend to rough him up, but ended up going too far and causing his death? And before he lost consciousness, why did Artemis try to pretend that no one else was responsible for what happened to him? Was he trying to protect somebody? And then there's the fact that an anonymous benefactor went to the trouble of paying for Artemis's funeral. If someone is willing to do that, then you'd think they must have felt remorse about what happened. But the fact that Artemis was brutally tortured seemed to suggest a very calculated attack from someone who really wanted to make him suffer. The man who phoned the funeral home seemed to change tone in the middle of his call, as he seemed sympathetic enough towards Artemis to ensure he got a proper burial, but at the same time, he remarked that cheaters usually get what's coming to them, and implied that Artemis deserved what happened to him. And why would someone impersonate Artemis by writing letters to his family in Birmingham, and then phone them up with some fake story about Artemis getting married in Egypt? Artemis hadn't been home in over a year at that point, and his family didn't have the slightest idea what he'd been doing since he left. It's not like they ever reported Artemis missing or were constantly hounding the police to find him. The whole situation is pretty mind-boggling, but I'll do my best to try and piece this puzzle together. Obviously, the key is figuring out what happened to Artemus Ogletree between the time he left his home in Birmingham, Alabama in April of 1934 and when he checked into the Hotel President in January of 1935. It sounds like Artemis lived a relatively unremarkable life in his hometown, so what could the 17-year-old kid have gotten mixed up in during those 9 months which led to him being murdered in such a brutal fashion? According to Artemis's family, his plan was to hitchhike to California, and since he kept listing Los Angeles as his hometown when he checked into those hotels, this might imply that he spent some time in LA at some point. But what brought him to Kansas City, Missouri? We also have that wrestling promoter who claimed that he interacted with Artemis in Little Rock, Arkansas, a state which borders Missouri. And let's not forget that Jordan, the mysterious caller who phoned Artemis's mother, he claimed he was calling from Memphis, and Tennessee borders Missouri, Arkansas, and Alabama. When you look at the geography, we've got 4 states in close proximity to each other, and California is a great distance away, so who knows if Artemis ever made it there. There's also the issue of Artemis using multiple aliases. In addition to Roland T. Owen, he apparently also used the names Eugene K. Scott and Cecil Werner. What would compel this seemingly ordinary 17-year-old to use so many different aliases? Well, at the risk of sounding cynical, the guy's name was Artemus Ogletree, and who wouldn't feel compelled to use a pseudonym with a name like that? But all joking aside, I get the sense that Artemis was involved in something shady. Remember, we have multiple hotel staff members describing Artemis as looking nervous and sitting in a dark room with the shades drawn, staring off into space. Their descriptions sound pretty eerie, and seem to indicate that Artemis had gotten himself mixed up in something he shouldn't have. Now, one detail which has always been up for debate is the young man Robert Lane gave a ride to on the night before Artemis was found. Lane was convinced this man was Artemis because he believed they had matching scratches on their left arm. However, the detectives were skeptical about this because there were no reported sightings of Artemis leaving or entering the hotel that night, and given that he was staying on the 10th floor, it seemed unlikely that he could have slipped out without anyone noticing anything. Remember, these are the old days when elevators had operators, and from what I can tell, the operator never mentioned giving a ride to anyone matching Artemis's description that night. Granted, it's certainly possible that Artemis could have left the hotel by using the stairwell or climbing out the window. The fact that he was seen outside in the middle of winter in an undershirt gives credence to the possibility that he had to escape the hotel room in a hurry once trouble started. But even if he slipped out, could Artemis have re-entered the hotel without anyone noticing? It's possible he could have done so using a fire escape, but I can't even be sure if the hotel had a fire escape or what the layout would have been like back in 1935. It also doesn't sound like there were any reported sightings of a man wearing an undershirt entering or exiting the hotel that night, and you'd think the detail about the undershirt would have made him stick out. Even though Lane said his passenger mentioned killing someone tomorrow, it's possible that he could have just been some other random young man who got into an altercation with someone else and had absolutely nothing to do with Artemis. It's tough to know for sure. But I'm inclined to believe the sightings of the woman who made the trip to the 10th floor that night are nothing more than a red herring. The elevator operator claimed he'd seen this woman multiple times in the hotel before, so I tend to think she may have been a prostitute who frequently used the hotel to service her clients. It's possible this woman really did go to room 1026 to meet a client who never showed up. Remember, when this woman returned to the hotel with an unidentified man, they went to the 9th floor. I have a feeling she was just there servicing multiple clients that night, and even if the woman and her male companion did leave around the same time Artemis was believed to have been attacked, I tend to think they had nothing to do with one another. However, I am intrigued by the noises reported by the guest in room 1048, which included the sound of arguing couples, a scuffle, and a gasping sound. I wish I had more information on the exact time she heard those sounds, because if she heard any of them before 11 p.m., when Robert Lane picked up the mysterious male passenger, then it would lend credence to the possibility that this young man was either Artemis after he got into a scuffle, or someone else who had been beaten up by Artemis and decided to get revenge later that night. But there's little doubt in my mind that she probably heard some sounds of Artemis being beaten and tortured, and that there were multiple people involved, both male and female. So the big question is, who would these people have been? Well, we've got 2 anonymous callers and 2 extra names associated with this case. We know that Artemis was speaking on the phone with a guy named Don, and he also left a note for this Don. Was Don the male caller who phoned the funeral home and sent money to pay for Artemis's burial? We've also got an anonymous female caller who phoned the Kansas City Journal-Post, along with a card attached to the roses sent to Artemis's funeral, which read, "Love forever, Louise." So of course, it's easy to assume that Louise was the female caller. So we've got a Dawn and a Louise involved in this whole thing, but were they the actual killers? Well, the male caller mentioned that he wanted Artemis to be buried near his sister, that Artemis had jilted a girl he promised to marry, and he also said cheaters get what's coming to them. So that gives us a pretty compelling potential motive. Artemis was engaged to a woman, possibly named Louise, and was murdered because he cheated on her or broke off their engagement. Hell, I even considered the possibility that the mysterious woman seen on the 10th floor that night might have been someone Artemis was having an affair with, or even a prostitute he'd hired for the night. But even so, this crime involved tying up a naked man, beating him across the skull, strangling him, and stabbing him several times before stealing all of his clothes. I know people tend to get angry when they've been cheated on, but this sounds like a major overreaction. Not to mention that they were brazen enough to do this in a hotel room, where there's a huge risk of being caught by staff and other guests. Since Artemis tried to say he injured himself rather than name his attackers, you might think he was trying to protect someone. But the guy had his skull bashed in, so you might have just been confused when he said that. Remember, a bellhop had knocked on the door earlier that morning, and Artemis told him to come in and turn on the lights without actually unlocking the door, so he was probably experiencing severe brain damage. So now let's talk about the strangest part of this story, the mysterious benefactor who sent money for Artemis's funeral. If that person was the killer, then this is honestly the first time I've ever heard of a murderer anonymously paying the expenses for their victim's funeral. Like I said earlier, it's such a weird contradiction. Someone must have had intense anger and hatred towards Artemis in order to brutally torture him like that, yet someone obviously had enough compassion for the guy to ensure he got a proper burial. If this was the same person, then that's all sorts of messed up. But it's certainly possible that both the anonymous benefactor and the anonymous woman who phoned the newspaper had no direct involvement in Artemis's murder, but knew exactly what happened to him and had a lot of sympathy. Now, the fact that someone went to the trouble of impersonating Artemis to send letters to his family, that can actually be interpreted in multiple ways. Artemis had not seen his family for nearly a year, and he was murdered in an entirely different state from where he was from. It doesn't seem like the Ogletree family would have had any way of connecting Artemis to his killers, so it really wasn't necessary to fool them like that. The mysterious Jordan who telephoned Artemis's mother was actually taking a risk by letting her hear his voice, and it would not surprise me at all if Jordan was the same person who called the funeral home. But while it might seem like someone was doing this to sadistically toy with the Ogletree family, you can also sense some compassion in their actions. By fabricating a story about Artemis getting married to a wealthy woman in Egypt, someone might have thought they were sparing the Ogletrees from the horrible truth about their son's death by making them believe he was living a happy life somewhere, though it doesn't sound like the Ogletrees really bought that story to begin with. Even so, it was pure chance that Artemis's mother happened to see his photo in a magazine article about the murder, so they could have easily gone for years thinking that he was off living in Egypt. I also think there's some significance to the fact that whoever did this knew the Ogletree family's address and phone number in order to contact them. This was the 1930s when obtaining out-of-state addresses and phone numbers was much more difficult, so this suggests to me that Artemis got close enough with someone to share his former home address with them. But look at it this way. If the letters and the phone call from Jordan had never happened, and the Ogletrees still found out about Artemis's murder by seeing his photo in a magazine, nothing would have been different about the investigation. Either way, they still wouldn't have any idea who the killer was. However, the icing on the weirdness cake for the story has to be the phone call to the Kansas City Public Library nearly 70 years after the fact. John Horner, the researcher who took the call, looked into the case and did an extensive write-up about it on the Kansas City Public Library website, so he's probably the main reason that information about the mystery of room 1046 is available on the internet. Given the amount of time that passed, the person who made the call obviously had no direct involvement in what happened, but I am damn curious about this mysterious something they supposedly found in the box. They said it was something mentioned in articles about the case, so I'm guessing it might have been one of the items missing from Artemis's room where his body was found. I wonder if it's the missing room key, or maybe a missing towel which has something distinctive written on it to indicate it's from the hotel president. Otherwise, how would this person even know this item is connected to the murder scene? But if the caller actually found a piece of evidence connected to an unsolved homicide, why would they contact a researcher at a library instead of the police? Why not come forward with this information? It seems likely that the caller was related to someone who may have had direct involvement in Artemis's murder, and they just didn't want to present evidence which could publicly brand their relative as a killer. So given that we're discussing an 80-year-old cold case with a limited amount of available information, is it even possible to formulate a theory about what happened? Well, kinda. Believe it or not, during my searches of the Google News archives, I discovered that the police did uncover an interesting lead a few years after the murder. In August of 1937, a trunk was discovered at a railroad express agency in New York with blood dripping out of it. When the trunk was opened, it contained the nude body of a local racketeer and dope peddler named Oliver George Sinecal. The trunk was traced to Sinecal's address, and it wasn't long before his roommate, Joseph Ogden, confessed to his murder, claiming that the two of them had gotten into an argument and fought over his gun, before it went off accidentally and killed Sinecal. Of course, since Ogden attempted to cover up the crime by stuffing Sinecal's dead body in a trunk and shipping it off to Memphis, he wound up getting a 20-year prison sentence at Sing Sing. Hilariously enough, You can see a reference to this case at the website reefermadnessmuseum.org. This shooting was listed in what was known as Anslinger's Gore Files, a list of cases compiled by Federal Bureau of Narcotics Commissioner Harry J. Anslinger, where someone allegedly committed murder while under the influence of marijuana. This was just one of the examples Anslinger cited as evidence that reefer turned you into a violent killer, though there's a lot of doubt that Ogden even smoked marijuana at all before the shooting. So how does this tie into the mystery of room 1046? Well, Ogden's real name was actually Joseph Martin, as he used numerous aliases throughout his life, including Donald Kelso. Well, records show that a Donald Kelso registered at the St. Regis Hotel in Kansas City in October of 1934, and since his handwriting matched Ogden's, it seemed likely they were one and the same. But what's interesting is that Kelso registered into the hotel along someone named Duncan Ogletree. This is just over 2 months before Artemus Ogletree's murder, and we know that he loved checking into Kansas City hotels under false names. And really, how many people named Ogletree would have been staying at hotels in Kansas City during this time period? I could write this off as a coincidence if not for the fact that Artemis made multiple references to someone named Don before his death. I think the chances are pretty good that Don was Donald Kelso, aka Joseph Ogden, Joseph Martin. Especially when you consider that this guy killed someone 2.5 years later, and then stuffed his nude body inside a trunk. And I also have to wonder if there's any significance to the fact that Ogden attempted to ship the body to Memphis, which, as you recall, is the same place where the mysterious Jordan phoned Artemis's mother from. While the police did investigate this connection, I don't think they found any hard evidence to tie Ogden to Artemis's murder, and I have no idea what happened to him after he went to Sing Sing. I'd say there's a good possibility this guy was the killer, but that still doesn't answer a lot of questions. How did he get mixed up with Artemis? Did Don pay for Artemis's funeral before sending the letters and making the phone call to his family? Who was Louise? Was Louise Don's sister? Was Artemis engaged to her? Did Don decide to murder Artemis because he jilted Louise? If 2 couples were heard inside room 1046, were there other people involved in Artemis's murder? Without more information, I don't think I can formulate a fully fleshed out theory about what happened, but I can theorize about a few things. I think that Artemis left Alabama and somehow got involved in criminal activity on his journey to California. I know that Joseph Ogden and Oliver George Sinecal were allegedly involved in dope peddling, so maybe Artemis got mixed up in the drug trade as well. If Artemis was involved in something illegal, that would explain why he kept using different aliases while checking into hotels. It seems likely that Artemis also became involved with a woman at some point, possibly the mysterious Louise, but he somehow did something to her which led to his brutal demise. Whether it was Joseph Ogden / Donald Kelso who decided to kill him, I can't be certain. But it seems pretty clear that Artemis must have fell in with the wrong crowd, since all the eyewitness sightings from the hotel staff described him as looking nervous. He probably felt he had done something wrong and was expecting consequences, though the consequences turned out to be a lot worse than he possibly could have imagined. I couldn't tell you how many people were directly involved in Artemis's murder, but it's clear that at least one person had remorse about what happened, which is why they paid for his funeral, and kept contacting his family to give off the impression he was still alive. We will probably never know the whole truth about what happened to Artemus Ogletree after he left his home in Birmingham in April of 1934, but I have a feeling it's one hell of a story. So that brings an end to our epic episode about the mystery of Room 1046. Since this case is nearly 82 years old, I normally wouldn't bother with my reminder to contact the appropriate authorities if you have information, but since someone apparently found something in a box a few years ago which might be relevant to this case and decided to contact a public library about it, I'd like to advise that person to come forward and please share what they have found with the proper authorities. Whoever murdered Artemus Ogletree is probably long dead, but it would still be nice to somehow solve this mystery after all these years. Regardless, if you just have your own theory about what happened, I'd still love to hear from you. So feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. A big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and he also happens to be the managing editor of The Back Row, the host website for this podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at listverse.com and crack.com, particularly my Halloween-themed articles. So have yourself a happy Halloween, and I hope you've enjoyed this month's Halloween-themed episodes. Join me next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.